The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Vision New England webinar series. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule today to join us for the event. My name is Michael Froning, and I am the VP of Operations for Vision New England, and I'll act today as your host. Before we get started, I wanted to kind of talk through you a couple of logistics with the software. One is today our schedule will run from noon to 12:45. We'll do our best to get you out on time. During that process, we'll have a couple of opportunities for you to ask questions. The event is really for you, so we want to give you that opportunity to shape content. A couple of ways to do that. You have a chat function where you can type in a quick chat question or item to me on the back end, and I'll field your question. Or two, you can type out a formal question in your question box there. So those should be two easy ways to get in contact with me. Today, we're proud to have our president, Ryan Howell, join us, and he will be interviewing William Vanderbloemen, CEO and founder of Vanderbloemen Search Group. William has over 15 years of ministry experience as a senior pastor and pastor, and prior to his founding of the Vanderbloemen Search Group, he's studied executive search under a mentor with over 25 years of search experience at the highest level. So William is going to join us today and share with us 9 practical tools we can use as we contemplate our personal and organizational succession plans. So Ryan and William, welcome to our webinar series today.
So thank you, Mike. It's great to be here. William, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much. I love getting to learn more about what you're doing in New England and how you guys are helping in a part of the country that, people don't realize it was kind of the first Bible Belt of the United States. And great to see y'all doing more and more to let the church re-flourish in your part of the country.
Yeah, I know, that's awesome. And we know you guys have worked with churches here in our area, and this topic of succession, transition is a hot topic. We've been at Vision New England over the last year and a half, been traveling around talking with leaders and just saying, hey, what do you think are some of the areas of growth and necessity here within the kingdom and church world? And one of the things that we heard over and over again was church transition, like succession, that thinking. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today, and I think it'll be helpful. And we, as we kind of set the stage for the conversation, William, we have like the gamut of church sizes in New England, like any place else, from the church of 25, 50, 100 people to the church of 2,000, right? So succession and transition looks kind of different for all of those folks. And I think as we're talking, I wanted to just, I think there might be some kind of thoughts out there that say, oh, well, Vanderbloemen and what they do, that's only for the big churches, right? That's only for the churches that have thousands and thousands of people. Like, maybe before we even get into it, could you just share a little bit about that mentality and how, thinking about succession really does transcend church size?
Well, thanks so much. And you have hit the nail on the head with where our heart is and where the bulk of our work is. And just give you a little bit of background. Thanks for the introduction. Very flattering. Everybody out there, don't believe everything you hear on the internet. But did spend time in churches long enough to know that when we set out to try and build a solution to help churches find their pastor or work through succession faster and better than they have in the past, it was a new idea, right? And I remember coming home from a very secure, well-paying job with good people at an oil and gas company, and saying to my wife, we'd just gotten married, we just had blended our families and 6 kids, new house. And I said, baby, I think I'm supposed to quit my job and start something new for churches. And she just looked at me and said, that's because churches love new ideas, right? And, she actually gets credit for the company because it's her job in the marriage to say, love your vision, your dream, now go back to work. But instead, she said, let's try it. So all that's to say, when we started, it was a new idea, and churches and new ideas are not best buddies, right? So the first churches to hire us tended to be churches that liked taking risks, which at the time was almost exclusively large entrepreneurial churches. So we started working with most of the very, very large churches. But as the idea has kind of normalized, and as the conversation about succession has become something that's not a dirty conversation you can't bring up in public, what I call the normal size church has become sort of our bread and butter. We still work with all the larger churches, but I tell folks around here, you may not call a church a small church unless it is bivocational pastor with under 100 people coming on a Sunday. And there are a lot of those, and they're great. But normal is a couple hundred people, maybe even a little less than that. That's normal. It is not normal to have thousands and thousands on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So 50% of our work last year was for the normal church. And I remember when I went in my senior pastor journey, I went from a church, when I went there, we had 140 in attendance with no kids at all. And it grew to, when I left, about 800 in attendance. And then I left to become senior pastor of a church of about 5,000 adults and a couple thousand kids. And I'm like, making this jump from small and medium sized to large, what do I? So I asked a bunch of people, and the best answer I got when I said, what's the difference between the two? A pastor of a really large church said, William, the large church is the same as the normal church. The large church just has more zeros.
Yeah.
He was talking about a lot of different kinds of zeros. So
Yeah,
all this
absolutely.
to say, we work all over the country. We work where churches are. So obviously fewer searches in, say, Wyoming than in Atlanta, but a lot of work in New England and with a lot of normal sized churches.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. So let's talk about things that you all are learning that could be helpful to everybody in succession, transition. And we are going to hopefully kind of talk about both of those things. They are different, right?
Yes.
Succession, transition kind of thinking. But so talk to us about things like overlap, transition time in succession world. That's kind of, do these two pastors function together in overlap? In transition world, that might be like how long does the search take, and how much time should a pastor give the church if they're resigning and moving forward? So maybe we spend a few minutes talking about this kind of idea of overlap.
Sure. And just to make sure I understand and everyone's speaking from the same sheet of music, if the outgoing pastor knows that they're leaving, usually that's a retirement situation. It's not, I got called to a bigger church or a different place, or it's what I would call a planned succession. How long should there be between the time that we hire the new guy and the time that the old guy leaves, or woman, whichever way it is? Should there be a time where they're serving together? And the answer is, it depends. And you know, having done 1,500 repetitions now in succession, I tell our new consultants, you know, 1,500 churches, let me tell you something. If you've seen one church, then you've seen about one church. So don't take anything I say today as the cookie cutter for how it should be done. So much of an overlap depends on the chemistry between the outgoing and the incoming. A lot of it depends on the circumstance for the outgoing person going out. Sometimes it's a happy retirement. Other times it's a time where it's been really hard and tense, and it's time for a change. And that might not be as much of an overlap. Now, when there is a chance for two people who get along in a healthy situation to overlap, what I'm finding is, this is the number one question I get asked, and I'm yet to hear anyone say that longer than 2 years is helpful. So it's like there's overlap can help over a long period of time, but the diminishing returns really drop off after 2 years. And we just did a survey of everybody we've done a succession for and asked them, what's the ideal length of time for overlap in your succession? And the overwhelming answer we got back was 3 months plus or minus a month. So, you know, that's time to do things like show you where things are, introduce you to key members, introduce you to key donors, but not so long that there gets to be a confusion about who the pastor is. So 2 years is absolute max. 3 to 4 months, if an overlap should happen, would be the norm. And I'd just be real careful on assuming that there always needs to be an overlap.
Interesting. Have you found for the church that's kind of dealing with this and the transition out? Sometimes retirement can be, someone comes in, spends a season of 7 or 8 years right before retirement, and then sometimes people spend 30, 35 years, in retirement. So I followed a pastor at our current church who was here for 35 years. And do you suggest in any of those ways, like how should the church think about like the timing for just the prep of it all, right? Like I think like, okay, now you've hired them. Now the question is, what's the overlap? But the space in between are you finding that some churches say, well, if the pastor's been here for X long, there's this much time without a pastor is healthy, or does that question make sense?
It does, and I think that what I'm learning is it really depends on the circumstances surrounding the person that's leaving. So, if they're leaving well, and I would say that there are no categorical imperatives in succession, but the general trend I see is pastors stay a little bit too long. And I think some of that can be solved by beginning the conversation about succession within the first month of a pastor's tenure. That's a wild thought, but you go there when you're 35, within the first month, the first or second board meeting, I think it's on the pastor, not the board, but it's on the pastor to say, I want this at the top of the agenda. Let's start a conversation now about how we know when it's time for me to begin a formal transition. And that might be 30 years from now. It might be set by markers. Like when we quit sending people to the mission field, we've lost our effectiveness. Or for some churches, it might be when we're not feeding the poor, that's been our hallmark. Like that would be a sign that we're losing. For some, it would be as simple as we've been growing. When we start to see that we're having diminished growth and then we plateau and decline, then we need to have a conversation. And if you start it that early, then you create a dynamic where the transition out doesn't have to be painful. John Maxwell told me many years ago when I went to this rather large church as a very young senior pastor, I asked him what I should be doing. And he said, he said, the smartest young leaders spend their early years creating options for their later years. So what does that mean? Well, things like church board members that are listening right now, you've got a younger pastor. Let me tell you something you could add to your compensation package that won't cost you a lot of money, but would make a ton of difference at the end of your pastor's tenure. And that's build in a reimbursable account for your pastor to go hire a certified financial planner and help them look and see how much will I need to be putting away now and in what kind of portfolio so that when retirement comes, I can actually afford to retire. Some congregations are with great groups like Guidestone, and that might not be necessary. Other congregations might say, well, we've got a financial planner in our church, we'll do it for free. No pastor wants to, open the kimono on their earnings and their portfolio to church members, right? So just a couple $1,000s a year in a reimbursable account early in the pastor's tenure to say, let's start thinking now about how you get to the end and can afford it. Because I'll tell you, man, it's shocking how often we go into a church, big church, normal sized church, doesn't matter. Pastors usually can't afford to retire. And I think creating options in the early years for your later years would go a long, long way. And that's just a simple little tweak that board members can do that would significantly change the trajectory of pastors that don't have to work 3 more years to make it work when they've really been kind of limping toward the finish line.
Yeah, and in succession and retirement, that becomes just a very logistical reality. The pastor who, I'm going to do this till I'm, in the grave, but the church goes to the grave with them sometimes because it's just a matter of financial realities. Oh,
well, it's not just financial reality, Ryan. It's I call it this. So, number one fear people have, according to a whole lot of polls, it's not death, it's public speaking, right? So, I mean, the old Seinfeld line was, most people would rather be the subject of a funeral than the speaker at the funeral, right?
Yeah.
So what is it that God puts in a person that they not only get up every week to publicly speak, but their speech is about what the creator of the universe intends for your life. I mean, that's a major, big courage factor that pastors have, no matter what size room you're talking to, right? The flip side, like all of our greatest strengths unguarded become our greatest weaknesses, right? The flip side of that amount of courage is a shadow, and it whispers in pastors' ears saying, you can go one more season. You can go one more season. I called it in the book we wrote, Brett Favre syndrome. If you remember, Brett just couldn't quite ever hang it up and kept bouncing around from team to team. So I don't think it's all financial. I think there's a whole lot of moving parts. But if you can get finances off the table, then the other conversations aren't nearly as hard.
Absolutely. No, that's good. That's good. So let's talk about kind of in some spaces is a really tricky situation, is like whether it's transitioning in a new pastor, like you're going just through a transition of a pastor leaves, new pastor comes in, or whether it's succession, when you start talking about the spouse, right? Because the reality is like the spouse doesn't necessarily work for the church, but is a part of this. And what are you guys learning in terms of the spouse in transition and succession, and how are churches dealing with that in a healthy way?
Yeah, so it's the chapter that we really couldn't put in the book because people would have sent us mail bombs. But too often, and I'm making some generalizations here. Okay, so statistically speaking, most pastors are male, right? I know there's some female pastors. I know that in New England, and particularly in congregational churches, you might have a little higher skew. But just statistically speaking, let's talk about male pastors. And statistically, most of those pastors are married. As long as they're not Catholic, then they don't need to be married. And so statistically, a man who's married, right? Many, many times in my experience working with pastors and the research I've done, you have a pastor who has taken a call because he's a pioneer and he's going to go where God calls him. And then you've got a wife that's left behind to pull up roots wherever she was and refigure out the root system in a new place. Okay. So in a long tenured pastor, when the pastor retires, I think churches have failed to take care of the spouse. And because you're asking, and again, with generalizations, you're asking a woman who has built her family, raised her kids, probably buried some good friends, maybe even seen their kid walk down the aisle of the congregation they serve. I mean, there's not many occupations, pastor and pastor's spouse. There are not many occupations that will consume your whole life more than those two roles. And so when it's time to like say goodbye, a lot of people forget that both people are saying goodbye, even if you've only been paying one. And it is very hard to let go of that root system. It's almost an innate maternal instinct. And a lot of times that we've seen successions blow up, it's because either the church didn't honor the spouse of the outgoing pastor, or the pastor and his spouse didn't do the hard work of saying, we really have to pull up the roots. Like you cannot, I'll mention a church by name, which I don't usually do, but First Baptist Dallas, which was just the big Mac Daddy church in the Southern Baptist Church. Dr. Criswell did such a good job there. And he and his wife had a great ministry. But after he died, she stayed. She kept teaching Sunday school. It was still broadcast throughout Dallas. And that made it very, very difficult for new pastors to come in and really be the pastor. So, and that's not laying any intent at anybody's feet. It just, there's a succession for both parties. And sometimes the more emotional journey is for the spouse who's been planting roots and making unseen sacrifices for the church throughout their whole time.
Yeah. So how does a church go about doing that in a healthy way for the exiting spouse and maybe even the entering spouse, right? Like what is that assessment? Where have you seen that done really well?
Well, I think it requires actually interviewing both parties. So when we do a search that's going to follow a succession, and again, we're talking about making a presumption that this is a succession following a person who's retiring, who's been there quite a while and is beloved. Okay. There are a lot of other circumstances that are different, but in that case, we do like a job description for the current pastor's spouse, and I was talking to a pastor's wife, and it's a fairly large church. This is 7,000 on the weekend, and I said, so what do you do? Oh, I don't do anything. He's the one that works here. I just attend. I said, oh, okay. So have you done anything for the church that would be like a volunteer thing in the last, say, month? She said, well, yeah, I mean, I run our greeter ministry for first-time guests. So, oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So anything else? Well, I mean, there's the system's up and running, but I kind of run that. So, all right. Anything else? She said, not really. I mean, we did just have all of the pastor's spouses over for dinner. They come over once a month, and I have dinner with them, and we do a Bible study. And so she rattled off like 7 incredible things she was doing for the church, and she really didn't think she was doing anything for the church. And she'd been doing it for so long and doesn't have little kids anymore that she kind of didn't realize, like, okay, now I'm going to go find a 30s or 40s-year-old woman with little kids and no time, about to pull her hair out because he's gone again to another meeting, and there's going to be a gap between what you're offering and what the snoop. So interviewing the outgoing spouse and then interviewing the incoming spouse to see, are they going to be radically different? And if they are, let's build a plan for that. Or are they going to be the same? And how do we build on strengths? So there's a lot of self-awareness that's needed. As far as honoring the outgoing spouse, I think one of the best things the church board can do is set aside a fund, or create in the South, growing up, we would have called it a love fund. Y'all probably don't have that up there. Probably not the best name for offerings anymore, but create an offering that would go directly into an account that would be used for the pastor and his spouse to go rent a VRBO for 6 months wherever they want to be. And it's major honor. It's not asking you to move. It's not asking you to get out of town or go away from the church. Major honor, major go do, build your bucket list of things you want to. We had one client, she played tennis, and the church, part of the deal was they got tickets to the US Open in New York for them. It was a big deal. So give them a dream 6-month vacation. That will honor them. It will bring closure. And the other thing it'll do is it'll buy that new pastor 6 months on their own with no shadows to try and live past.
Yeah, no, that's good.
And we usually say it should be a 6-month window, just a little extra here, that covers either Christmas or Easter. And maybe it's sometimes both, but that usually gives enough time. And this sounds so jaded, but do a major holy day. And then there'll be some disaster that happens. Somebody dies that's unforeseen or something. And you don't want to sound opportunistic, but those are the moments of pastoral glue, where the new person really becomes the pastor of the church. And having the previous pastor and their spouse on a "we're honoring you" trip for 6 months creates a lot of space for that to happen. Yeah,
no, that's good. That's good. Let's talk about church governance in transition and succession. What are kind of the questions that a church should be asking of their governance structure policy as they start to enter into succession or coming into it?
Yeah, this is super important. I think it's the same thing, no matter what the circumstance for the succession is. So you might have a church that the pastor's been there 30 years, and unless it's a combative board and a combative relationship, which happens a lot, but if they've been there 30 years and they've done well, chances are they can pretty well get whatever they want passed through the board. And a lot of the board members tend to be people who are friends with the pastor and have known him a long time, or came to Christ under their ministry. Or, I mean, it's not a relationship neutral situation, right? So you bring in brand new pastor, and they've got to work with a board that they don't know. They don't even know if they like them yet. None of them came to Christ under the ministry. None of them grew old together. And so is that governance that's really not been a rubber stamp, but been enjoying a benevolent dictator for a long time? I mean, really, can they transfer that level of authority to the new guy or not? And on the flip side, And we see this sometimes with these long-standing pastors, but other times where we're working with a very large church right now where the pastor had to leave, had to accelerate retirement and leave suddenly. And the big danger there is the governance going to rebound from benevolent dictator to we're going to be really high control, so these things won't ever happen again. And it's kind of like you know how in high school you had the girlfriend and the rebound girlfriend, right? And she's nothing like anything. I don't want anything like the old girlfriend. A lot of times I see governance, the pendulum swing when it's been a bad departure from what was really healthy with some soft spots to ultra high control and no room for an entrepreneur. So I think it's is our governance aware of what we've actually been doing? And are we going to be able to allow that to continue with the new person? And it may mean that you need to start talking about changing your governance out a little bit. I wouldn't go rewriting your bylaws while you're looking for a pastor, but do you have a pipeline of successors for the members of your board? And do you have a succession plan in place for whether we have a departure on bad terms and we not overcorrect, or on really good terms, and how do we not expect the new guy to be benevolent dictator?
Yeah, it sounds like kind of what you're describing is there a process of self-evaluation of that
That's right.
governance and of those teams to just let's hit before we get too steeped into things, let's take our temperature here and just really self-evaluate.
That's exactly right.
And give some thought to it. Now this is a kind of an interesting reality. We hear stories of, the pastor who is maybe a founding pastor and they're retiring, and the question becomes, okay, what is their role in the succession process? Like, what is their involvement in that, right? Because it's different than, okay, a pastor might be resigning to take on a new call. Maybe even that pastor has been there for a while. There's still some kind of like, clear boundary, they're leaving, we got to find a new person. But in a retirement situation, a pastor who's been there a long time, what's the tendency for the involvement to be of that pastor? And is there kind of I know every church is different, is there a kind of a healthy recommendation for their involvement in that process?
Well, I think it's going to be different for everybody, but I will say the best scenarios I've seen are where if the pastor is going to be involved, if it's healthy and we want the pastor involved, and many times no one knows the church better than the pastor who's been there a long time, so he can be a real asset, right? What I've never seen work is the pastor be just a little bit involved in the search. Like, so the best scenarios I've seen is when the pastor is either fully involved or fully detached, but never just a little bit of bits and pieces. What do they call? They call it seagull leadership, right? Don't come in from a high altitude, swoop down, crap on everything, and then go back up. That doesn't work. So if you're going to be involved, be fully involved. If you're not, then don't.
Yeah. Yeah, just enough to do damage and sabotage the process never works well.
Right. Exactly.
So what if so now you've got a pastor who their family has been a part of this church for 30 years, maybe even founder of the church. This is, like you said, like deep roots. Like, these are people's families, their lives have been in this community. What's their role? Like, what should be that kind of outgoing pastor's new role in the life of that church? Have you seen or learned things that principally can be really great or really difficult? But that seems to me to be a tricky thing, because it's like, man, the church is more than an organization that's led by a leader. I mean, there's family, there's, we've walked through hard times together and difficulty and support, and it's a unique space, right? People enter into retirement and they have community, but this could be a potential complete loss of community. So what should be that outgoing pastor's role?
Well, it's interesting. Retirement is only mentioned a couple times in the Bible, and it's always about the priests, and it's always mandatory. And if you're like me and you've been guilty of saying to people, there's no retirement in the Bible, you need to volunteer in our children's ministry, no matter your age. Well, actually, there is retirement, and it talks about the priests. And it was when they were wandering around the desert, they had to pack up the tent every time the cloud moved, the people moved. And those guys are like, oh man, the cloud moved, and now we got to unpack all this stuff, and we got to carry it. And yes, they're happy to serve God, but it gets heavy after a while. And that was why they retired. And not to go uber spiritual, but it's almost like the lesson from that Old Testament scripture is there comes a time in life when carrying the things of God becomes too much for a man. Mm. And so they had to retire. Well, what did they do when they retired? Two things happened. One, the church community provided for them materially for quite a while. And that gets back to our certified financial planner or retirement planning or however you're going to honor the pastor. And then the second thing was the priests, yes, they retired, but they still had functions within the community. They didn't just sit on their hands. So what I'm finding is if finances is, to use those two things in modern terms, finance, the church helps the pastor have the means to live, and the pastor finds a new way to serve. So what I've found, sometimes that means they leave. Maybe they go be an intentional interim where they go to churches that use interim pastors and they do a year here and a year there. We're rewriting the succession book. It's going to come out next year. And one of my most exciting new expansions of the book is 10 new career models after you've retired. And it doesn't matter whether it's Francis Chan, who left his church young, or somebody who left at 65. There's just new ways to think about how to keep serving God after the local parish chapter is over. And then another thing that we tell people all the time is try and think, especially early on in your career, what are the things that you get really excited about that are not part of the senior pastor job? We've got one client who he was always so excited about mission work in Asia, particularly China. And when it came time for him to retire, the church provided and made a way for him financially. But one of the things they did was they opened a big mission portfolio for work in China and had him head that up. And of course you have to make really clear fence posts about what you can and can't do. You're going to manage Asia. You're not going to do the funeral of this person. You're going to manage Asia. You're not going to speak into the capital campaign. Other people, I've seen churches contract the retired pastor to be a director of development and to work on, increasing giving from people that are their same age and stage. There's just a whole plethora of things that can be done if it's papered up well. What I think is really, really hard though, the old mainline churches, like I grew up in the Presbyterian church, when the pastor retired, he went away. And in North Carolina, they all went to this little town called Montreat, and it was all retired pastors. By the way, I used to say, if that's a slice of heaven, I might consider the other option, but I don't want to live with all retired pastors. But I don't know that is the reasoning is previous pastor needs to leave and cut ties and not be a part of things. Well, that was real easy before this thing called social media, right?
Yeah.
It is insane to think that you can somehow mandate that the previous pastor not be around. They're going to be around. It's just how do we do it in a healthy way now? And that might mean locally and it might not. But having an honest conversation about it, particularly early before it gets urgent, just opens the playing field in a way that can make this a healthy thing and not one of the scores of disasters we've all heard of over the years.
Yeah, no, that's great, and it's a heartbeat of mine too for the churches in our area to recognize that I think there's a Jesus way to do this kind of like non-threatening power, authority, title thing that like honors new and honors retiring, and so it's really great to hear creative ways to do that I think maybe push us a little closer to God's heart for unity in the body. That's great. Let's talk about the disillusionment of our church is in succession. Like oftentimes retirement season is let's celebrate all the magnificent things that have happened under a leadership team and this season that's been so good. And maybe there might be a tendency to forget that there's some what I call like lumps under the rug, some things that just have been kind of brushed under there. So what's the role of like honest self-evaluation of the church in terms of succession? Kind of like this idea of, have we named our problems? Like, what does that look like in a healthy situation?
Yeah, I think one of the real gifts a church can give an incoming pastor is to have an honest self-assessment of what we're good at and what we're really not good at. Too often in church recruiting, you get volunteers that sign up for the search committee because they love their church and they're so excited about it that they only tell candidates about the lovely parts of the church. And, here's what I've learned about pastors over the years. They know that churches are dysfunctional, right? I mean, they know that, and they can handle almost anything except a surprise. Like, just tell me the issues and we'll work on them. Not a big deal. But I tell people when we do a search, one of the things I think God uses us for, whether you're a candidate thinking about the church or the church looking at a candidate, our job is to make sure you don't walk down the aisle with Rachel and wake up next to Leah, right? So like, let's just say what's what and go with it from there. But huge thing that churches can do is to be able to say, well, you know what we're really struggling with right now. And the outgoing pastor may or may not be a real help with that, because sometimes the struggles are due to a blind spot, and we all have them, but a blind spot in the outgoing leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, some churches are dealing with this, and in New England we have this, and I know some churches that have either been founded and have grown to a space, or they took on a strategy of multiplication and outreach that involved multi-site. And sometimes multi-site can be driven by, kind of organizational health and structures, and sometimes multi-site is really driven personality. So what are you seeing churches, are there questions that churches are asking in succession regarding if they have multiple sites, regarding is this time for them to become churches? Are there a series of questions or principles that are good for churches to think through in succession that might be in a multi-site situation?
Sure. Well, so for starters, the hands down expert on multi-site is my friend Tony Morgan at the Unstuck group. In fact, there was one other person, Jim Tomberlin, who's got a high level of experience, and Jim actually just joined Tony's team. So when we have a big multi-site question, like how do we unwind campuses, how do we immediately send them there, because they have the best questions to ask to find the right answers. Now, on the staffing side, we do deal with that. And we've seen, we've been spending 20, 25 years figuring out how to do multi-site, but I just think now, and I think you're going to see it more and more in the next 10 years, the new question is, how do we unwind the multi-site? Because it can be valuable to keep for the new pastor, or it might be valuable to get rid of. We got asked to help just this last year with Max Lucado's succession. And so, that's easy. Just go find another Max Lucado, right?
Yeah.
No, not really. So one of the conclusions they arrived at was, probably we need to launch these sites as churches. Now, that's not always the case. We're working with another very, very large church in Texas where the conclusion was, no, we need to keep them. And some of that hinges on what has the multi-site been functioning like. Has it been independent, or is it a highly franchised version of the mothership, which is fine. I'm not judging either one of those models. But like some people would say, well, for our successor, we need to look at all the campus pastors. Well, maybe have they preached? Have they led? Have they had to raise money? Have they had to work with a board? Or have they been a host that functions like a general manager at a Chick-fil-A, which that's a great job too, but it doesn't mean they're ready for it. So it's an analysis of what have we been doing that can be repeated. So it's really hard to repeat the genius of Max Lucado's preaching. Like that's just, so broadcasting that over 20 campuses with just find me another one of those, not always the answer. I think it requires some careful thought. And I'll say this really loud. The sooner you start that conversation, the better. When we worked with Mariners Church out on the West Coast, very large church, it's taken them years to position some of their larger churches ready to be launched if that's what they do, because they needed to do board development. They needed to talk about how do we get land for some of these churches. They need to do, how do we get the budget where it's a self-sustaining church, even without central support. So there's a myriad of questions, and we're really good at naming the questions that a church has to answer. And then if they get into how do we develop a strategy, we send them over to Tony.
No, that's great. So that, here's a question I think is great for every church, regardless of size, because it's just the difference of zeros, right? What does succession mean and transition financially, right? You have your folks that are supporting, they're giving. Now there's tension, now there's transition, even in the best situations. Do you guys generally see impacts on succession? I mean, we know of a church here in New England that, they set a goal to raise X amount of dollars a percentage of their annual budget to put into savings for this period of transition from retiring to new leadership, to just cover dips that they thought were potential to happen. Are you seeing any good strategies in place from a donor reality and just the financial implications of succession?
Well, so the one universal implication I'll tell donors when I'm talking to a church board is the most expensive thing you can do for the church is screw up this succession. Like that, it doesn't get more expensive than that. And the larger the church, the truer that is. So smaller churches and then normal sized churches actually have a little bit easier time with a transition or a succession than the larger, but the larger the church, the higher the stakes. And call that, we're building a cult of personality, or call it whatever you want to call it. It's just a reality. And so when churches start looking at, like, we're going to do an overlap, are you kidding me? That means we're going to pay 2 senior pastor salaries for 2 years. Well, if that's the right answer, it's the cheapest way out. Or we're going to, okay, shameless plug, we're going to hire a search consultant and a succession consultant to help us through this. Yes, you are, because the most expensive thing you can do is screw this up. And it takes churches years to recover. So I don't hear me promising perfection from us, but just whatever expense there is needs to be dealt with, and realize that it's money worth spending. The other thing I tell donors is, what are you doing for a succession plan for your donor base? So especially the longer the pastor's been there, the more stable the donor base has been, and the big givers have always been the big givers. But what are you doing? Like, I'll tell churches, if it's been a long time pastorate and the church grew under their pastorate, whether it's grew to 200 or 2,000, usually that means the pastor got to know some really great business growth people early in their tenure that became donors, and they got excited about growth. And well, what are you doing to develop the next generation? And real quick, tangible tip. Do you, if you're a pastor right now or a board member, do you know who your top 50 givers are that are under 50 years old? And are you gathering those people in a way that's honoring them, or seeking their advice, or training and grooming and building them to be the next set of large donors for your church? Not many churches are doing that, but the succession is not just about the pastor. It's about the board. It's about the donor base. It's multifaceted.
No, that's really good, insightful. And sometimes we in church will tend to, like, you'll see leadership kind of run away from that because of some of the things that Jesus said about giving and just the fear that's there. But there really is this reality that giving is certain people's spiritual gift, and so the ability to walk with them and honor that gift is so important. So William, let me just pause here before we kind of wrap up. I want to see if we have any questions. Mike, did we have any questions from anybody for William on this topic? Did I lose you, Mike?
No,
yes, there you
did for a little bit, but thanks, Ryan and William, for sharing some really great kind of thoughts and steps to shepherd us through the process of succession that can be really cloudy and intimidating at times. We did have one quick question so far. If you have a question for William, feel free to type in a quick question and we'll be sure to ask that. But one question that a viewer asked or listener asked was kind of where do you start? I mean, it's just an intimidating process. I mean, are there some quick first steps or a template that you can kind of share with us to kind of get an organization or a pastor to kind of thinking about succession?
That's a great question. The simplest step I know. Well, I'll give you a real simple step. There's a book you'll see on a slide, right? And it's the whole point of that book was to make the first conversation easy. That's all. It's not 10 steps to getting rid of your pastor or anything. It is, how do we take what's been a conversation no one wants to start and make it easy to start? Read the book together. Once you get into the book, you'll see that we say, well, now that you're reading book, what do we do? One of the easiest things to talk about is, what's our emergency plan? Let's say William gets hit by a bus, or let's say William gets sick and is incapacitated for 6 months for whatever reason, or has to have surgery and can't do his job for 3 months. Who would take over the key roles that William's doing that only William's been doing? And that, no one's really intimidated by that, because how many people do you know that got hit by a bus? Not many, right? It's almost like the difference between planning a funeral versus buying life insurance in your 30s. Everybody buys life insurance. Who pre-plans their funeral? Very few, right? It defuses a combustible topic. So if there were an emergency, what would we do? And it just begins the thinking around what it would look like to have life here when the pastor isn't here anymore.
Good stuff. A quick follow-up to that as well is, are there typical pitfalls or process, the things that you see a church or an organization fall into that tend to derail the process?
The three that are real quick that come to mind, we've sort of covered. One, the pastor can't afford to retire. Two, the pastor doesn't know what to do after he retires, doesn't have an avocation or an idea what his role is going to be in the church or outside of it. And three, the pastor's spouse isn't ready to let go.
Yeah, Ralph asked too, what are some of the things that make it difficult for a church or an organization to attract a new pastor or a new leader?
Oh man, do we have another hour? You would think with all the social media and LinkedIn and everything, everybody be connected and it'd be easier than ever to find a pastor. I think it's harder than ever. And I could give a myriad of reasons. One being, especially if you're talking a retirement, many people want to go find a 40-year-old pastor. Just by birth rates, there are not as many of those as there need to be. There's really a supply-demand issue. So you either have to get someone who's older and has a few years left in their career, which can work, or you have to hand the church over to a millennial, which can also work. And I'm a big fan of millennials. But in a really complex situation, most people want that 40-year-old pastor, and there just aren't as many of those. So that's one piece that makes it difficult. Another is it's never been easier to look better on paper than you are in life, or better online than you are in life. And so it's hard to know really what you're getting. And the third reason that it's just so difficult is, yay for the church growth movement that decided to name churches Community Church and Crossroads and no longer denominationally named, but the de-emphasis on theology and the increased emphasis just on life application has made it harder than ever for search committees to figure out if the candidate they're looking at is going to match their DNA, because you can not talk about theology, but you're always using it.
Yeah.
And you hire somebody who's off 5 degrees theologically from where you are, and you've got a real problem. So this is totally self-serving, but we've found that sometimes we get to play the guide of a Sherpa. Like, we're not picking your pastor for you, but we're helping guide you along the mountain pass because we've walked it a bunch of times. And we found that it's a real help. So sorry, commercial over, but it's just harder than ever. And if we had a whole nother webinar, we could go deep with that.
Well, again, thanks, William and Ryan, for spending some time and sharing with us. It was really a good introduction into really getting us to think about practical ways to kind of tackle the succession process, and really even just getting us to do it in a way that's healthy and God honoring. So again, thank you for your time, both
Yeah.
Ryan, William, and everybody that took the time today to join us. A couple of quick announcements before we end. Vision New England is going to be hosting a forum on foster and adoptive care coming up in June. If you're interested in becoming a part of the conversation, to think about um, uh, this issue and how we how we as a church and a body of believers can make a kingdom impact in our communities through this issue, we invite you to join our get onto our webpage, visionnewengland.org, and check out more information and how you can be part of the conversation. And lastly, Vision New England we're committed to providing regular webinars such as this to our members and non-members of the community to really try to help connect Christians throughout New England. Each webinar will either provide a relevant and practical resource for the faith community, or it'll offer a story of what God is doing in our community, in our region. We are a member-based association that connects Christians throughout New England to accelerate what God is doing and to encourage intentional evangelism by either doing justice, loving mercy, walking humbly, and making disciples. If you're interested in membership and being a part of something that's bigger than you, bigger than your community, we invite you to again visit our webpage, visionnewengland.org, learn more about what it means to become a member, and support our efforts, such as these webinars and other services that we provide to help connect the body of believers in New England. So again, thank you for joining today, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for future webinars. Thanks, and God bless William and Ryan and everybody that attended.
Thanks so
Excellent.
much.
Mike,
Bye-bye.
will we be sending out, like in follow-up, will we send out William's contact information and Vanderbloemen for folks that might want to have a more in-depth conversation? Well, is that something we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Ryan. One I forgot to actually mention, but each participant will also get a link to this conversation so that you can listen to it. And we'll be sure to also put William's contact information in there as well.
Very
Thanks,
good.
guys.
Very good.
Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Again, thank
Thank
you.
you so much, William.
Bye-bye.